Hello, so this is our first lecture on the pre-Islamic Middle East. And in this particular lecture, we're going to look at the birth of humanity, the settlement into sedentary lifestyles, and how did that affect gender. So let's start off. And of course, when we start off, this is, of course, the pre-modern era. And this particular lecture is going to look at the Middle East when it was polytheistic, or when there was a worship of multiple gods. Like I said, I'll never ask for a particular date. All of this is just to orient you to the various dynasties we're going to be talking about. And let's begin. This is kind of just a chart. We'll begin this lecture with the events. Okay. Now, this is a quote from the historian William Durant. Okay. Just read it on your own. And if you want, you can just watch these videos on your own. They're a set of comedy videos. I call this an anthropology documentary. But I really want to start off with this video.
"60-second adventures in religion. Number 3, religion as a mother. Why do so many people picture God as a man? J.J. Bachofen was a Swiss professor of Roman law who was probably a bit of a mummy's boy. He thought that religion was part of a process that began in the days before monogamy, when the only parent anyone could be absolutely certain of was their mother. So when people tried to make sense of the mysteries of nature, it was only natural to attribute them to a motherly character, hence a widespread prehistoric religion based around motherhood. But then men started to take more of a part in the family unit, hogging the remote control and indeed global control, so the idea of a nurturing goddess was soon replaced with a male god. Logical though this sounds, there's no proof there ever was a widespread matriarchal religion, so either Bachofen was wrong or those female gods were really good at cleaning up after themselves. But his ideas have inspired others, including scientist James Lovelock with his Gaia hypothesis that suggested you can better understand the whole biosphere of the Earth by seeing it as a single entity in a metaphorical female form. But as for those ancient goddesses, well, mum's the word.
Okay. So, what is that video suggesting? So the easiest way to kind of begin this class is start off when humans were hunters and gatherers. And when humans lived in this kind of lifestyle, a wandering tribe would be anywhere from the size of 10 to maybe 60 people at max. And what was the lifestyle of these kind of hunter and gathering societies? Well, the day consisted of getting enough food so you don't die. Now, hunting and gathering is a misnomer. It should be called gathering and hunting, because really it was gathering that generated most of the caloric intake to survive. Now, in terms of the act of gathering, the strength differential between women and men didn't really make a difference. You didn't have to be strong to gather material. Now, some would argue you do have to be strong to hunt, but you have to realize hunting in those days was, the men might go off to hunt, they would be lucky if they captured anything. In other words, when the men came and failed to bring anything home, Who had gathered most of the food? It would have been the women, right? Hunting, in fact, didn't all that time require strength. It was either you got animal protein through laying traps or corralling a group of animals off a cliff and then collecting their dead carcasses, and then bon appetit, you have dinner. In these kind of lifestyle, you are always on the move for food. And as a result, family sizes remain small. Okay. And why is that? You can't have a lot of kids and always be on the move. If you have a child, usually then you would space out having another child, maybe at least 3 to 4 years, until at least that child could walk and keep up with the hunting and gathering band, which meant what? That family sizes stayed small. Okay. Women had an important part in keeping the tribe not only alive, but feeding them as well. So in other words, we don't see what we call, the creation of gender doesn't really, in other words, these hunting and gathering bands tended to be egalitarian because the role of women and men, in fact, the women were doing the most important work. Now, why do we see kind of figures, as I show on this slide, a votive figure with a kind of abundant female form? Well, look at this, look at the hypotheses. If it's women who bring life into this world, surely then the world as we know it must have come forth from some kind of goddess figure. Because just as the woman creates life, surely a goddess figure created life on earth as we know it. And that's why if we go to the date of 29,000, BCE, when this would have been produced by a hunting and gathering band, you see images like this all over the world. Okay. In other words, suggests a kind of global phenomenon correlated to this lifestyle where God was seen as a woman. And really the goddess would continue as an idea to be venerated throughout this lecture. It's not until, let's say, the birth of Judaism and later Christianity and followed by Islam, where you have a single God. But even goddesses continue, even though in ancient Greek and ancient Roman religions, for example, you now have female goddesses alongside male gods. And this is a question, how did this happen? Why was this kind of change in the way deities were imagined? So here we see another example. And what were the goddess figures? Usually they were voluptuous. All that is considered life-giving. You see they have wild childbearing hips, augmented breasts, for example, all kind of example of the record that indicates early deification of a goddess figure. And here as late 6000 BCE. Here we see a goddess figure in what is today Turkey. And of course, this is a joke, but nevertheless is kind of an indication of the times when, in the imagination, how did the goddess figure emerge? And we see kind of this notion all the way in the 1600s, you still have this kind of depiction of a goddess Gaia figure, the earth embodied in the figure of a woman. Now, here we come to 6000 BC to Iraq, right? We still see goddess figures here, but at the same time, if this is 6000 BC, we see this archaeology that tells us that a goddess is deified. And here you just see a funny image that refers to the goddess votive figures. This changes everything. We're not exactly sure when settled agriculture began. But we definitely can correlate the birth of settled agriculture with the differentiation of gender. And in terms of working fields, again, both men and women can do it. But with settled architecture, why am I keeping saying architecture? Agriculture. The men's strength in creating irrigation ditches and managing domesticated animals, particularly big, onerous cows, definitely gave the advantage to men. So what happens as a result of this? It's resulting in this. The minute you create a sickle, what does that mean? You have a fixed location in which your food comes from, so that you're no longer hunting and gathering, right? Now, this is a long drawn out transition. Early human societies probably created a combination of both. But definitely once we have the transition to fixed agriculture, what happens? Well, number one, women were relegated to the home. If agriculture is more productive as a result of men managing the fields, women at home no longer have this restraint of always having to be mobile. They can produce more children. Combine that with having a fixed pace and more children, and what do you have the rise of? The first settlements that are eventually going to evolve into cities. And really the story of this lecture is how city created gender. Sex and the City is a story about 4 empowered women, but really the city was the worst thing for women, because it's the city that led to the differential in the role of men in society and women being relegated to the home. What we have for archaeological evidence is a concentration of settlements in an area in the south of Iraq that we refer to as the Sumerian civilization. Now, was settled agriculture discovered in other locations earlier to the Sumerians? Yes. But what we can definitely say was the Sumerians were the first constellation of city-states to emerge. In other words, numerous city-states. And these numerous city-states developed records, the first examples of writing. And what does writing allow us, historians, is an insight into the past. And one of those insights is the relationship between men and women. In other words, the study of gender history. So if we zoom in on the Sumerian area, we see these cities that emerge in the south of what is today Iraq, and then later city-states would develop in the north, and those city-states would take over the Sumerian civilization. But if we look at places such as Ur and Uruk, what records do we find? Well, go back now to this image that I showed you previously. Why was cuneiform, or writing, developed? On one level, to communicate notions of deities, notions of land, but also to keep track of quantities and commodities such as bread. And then you see here the first gender depiction, where kind of conceptually, mentally, the difference between men and women were put to papers. No, not paper, of course, but to clay stone. But I mean, in the minute of writing, there's an abstract revolution happening, where you see how the obvious image of a woman is, compare that to a man. You develop writing to keep track of other commodities and quantities, such as female slaves. So, of course, this is what these kind of records look like, and we have to say, for the most part, these would be the first primary sources in history. Now, around this time, what kind of Sumerian deities persist? Well, we have Ishtar. And you see here, Ishtar is still a goddess figure. Now, what's emerging is a matriarchal society, but the deities are still female in conception, right? So how is patriarchy emerging in Sumerian society? Okay. So imagine this. You have fixed agriculture. And the fixed agriculture, what was primarily cultivated? Grains, particularly wheat to make the bread. Okay. Grains also had another value. You could make beer out of them, and we're not sure which came first, the beer or the bread. But then the ultimate value of grains was that once cultivated, you could store them in silos in warehouses. Okay, now the minute you create warehouses, how do you prevent other people from stealing a bit more grain? What do you have to develop? Guards. Okay. And the creation of guards leads to what? The birth of now militaries. And if you're wielding weapons or maybe invading another city-state for their grain supply, what do you have the birth of? Not only militaries, but militaries for the most part who are going to be consisted of men. So now we see kind of another element of the gender differential. Women relegated to home while the men work the fields, men guarding the facilities. And then, of course, you need a class that prays for the rains to fertilize the grain. And the priests, for the most part, would be men. Now, keep in mind, there were female priests and there were queens, okay? In other words, what I'm describing is a slow, long process, but it's a process where men would eventually develop into the projectors of violence, and where the men would take over priestly functions and political functions, particularly that of the king, while women would more and more be relegated to the household. But keep in mind, if you're worshiping the goddess Ishtar here, what transition is occurring where you're going to have now male deities? Well, it occurs like this. Well, you see, in hunting and gathering societies, it's the females who create life. In agricultural societies, now men are saying, we are the ones who bring life forth, right? We are the one who bring life-sustaining food. We are the ones who manage not only the fields, but the labor-intensive irrigation works to bring water to the fields. And with this agricultural transition, another transition occurred where if men bring life, surely then there's also male gods who also bring life onto this world. And so what do you have then in these kind of scenarios is now the polytheistic pantheon, where you have male gods, female gods. Male gods would be associated with warfare. Female gods would be associated with procreation and birth. Okay. And then from that point onwards, as war was seen as more, given more primacy in social and political life, okay, the gods associated with war would have more power over the goddesses, reflecting a real-life sociological transition. So let's look at one example of how Ishtar, otherwise referred to as Inanna, was depicted. So here we see her figure, and again, now you can read Sumerian. All of you know what this is the Sumerian symbol of. So we know Ishtar is a woman, and we see wings on her back, right? So in the beginning, what do we see now? Earliest conceptions of Ishtar, still the goddess, queen of heaven, goddess of love and war, okay? Fertility and lust, right? And then we're going to see over history, a separate war of God would be created. So let's fast forward to the Roman Empire, where you have the god of war who is separate from the god of love. The god of wars would be known as Mars. And from Mars, we get words such as martial. And then the god of love would be known as Venus. Okay? And the Romans happened to consider the planets these gods, and they would give, so hence why we have a planet called Mars and a planet called Venus. This is now what's happening in art, is Ishtar is getting now kind of a bit more developed features. Here we can see the wings a bit more formed. We can see her face a bit more. And here we see Ishtar flanked by two owls. And keep in mind the imagery of the owls, because they're going to be a bit important, a bit later. Okay, but this is how we see the depiction of the Ishtar, the goddess Ishtar, in early Mesopotamian society. And how would she have looked during her times? Like all ancient statues, they were usually colored with pigments. This is a reconstruction of how ancient Sumerians would have seen the relief of Ishtar in a particular temple. Then let's jump now to this two more kind of ancient political entities that are going to emerge. Okay. The Assyrians would eventually take over Sumer, and the Assyrians were a much more martial race. They were much more of a militaristic empire, as was the Hittite Empire in what is Anatolia. And let's see now what kind of legal, environments did they create that govern gender differences. So the code of the Nesalim is a code developed by the Hittites. And what are we seeing in this ancient period is now a primary source where the pre-modern state governs that what is most intimate sexuality. Now look at code number 187, right? Bestiality was forbidden. It's the same with 199. Okay, bestiality is forbidden. But look at 187. Of course, I put 187 and 199 that governs bestiality. Law 188 governs incest, okay? And you see, of course, in all of these cases, what is the consequences? Well, the death penalty. But if we continue with this code, look what else does it say. If a man picks up a woman, now that one, now this one, then in the country, there's no punishment if it's consensual. In other words, if a man is a player, that's fine. What about a brother sleeping with a free woman, together or one after the other? Again, another player, we would say punishment. If a father and son sleep with a female slave or a harlot together or one after another, there is no punishment. Now look what happened with 195. If a man slept with his sister-in-law, it's a capital crime and you die. Now why is that? Because that is a crime akin to a man stealing his brother's property. And that is punishable by death. So you see now, this is what we could say a first law, but what can we read between the line? That the woman was considered property. A man could not have intercourse with a woman and her daughter. Why is that? Again, because it complicates let's look at the following, 197. If a man rapes a woman in the mountain, now see this, it's the man's fault. He will die. If he rapes her in the house, now look at this, it's the woman's fault. All right? Now, you see there, what is the underlying assumption? If the man had been able to enter the house, it must have been the woman's fault and she will be punished, okay? If in this extramarital affair, adultery, if the man finds him and kills him, there's no punishment for the man. The man has the legal right to kill both his wife and the man, even though the man might be an assailant raping his wife, the man has the right to kill both of them. So what are we seeing is the beginning of kind of the governing of sex, basically, in ancient times. The Assyrians would go on to conquer a much larger territory. And then it goes without saying that if the Assyrian Empire was militaristic, their main deity was definitely male. And what can we now say about the Assyrians? Again, we look at the primary sources, their legal codes. Okay. If a woman hits her husband, she's going to be prosecuted. She has to pay this much lead, and she will be whipped 20 times. Look at this, and I don't know what kind of fights they had back then. If she injures the testicle of a man, one of her fingers will be cut off. Now, if the physician is fixing his, the targeted guy's balls and they get infected, okay, or she hit both the nuggets, okay, what happens? She will be blinded. Okay, so you're seeing what's happening here now. If we want to say kind of this is an example of ancient misogyny, absolutely. Okay. But here we're seeing is kind of the enforcement of capital punishment by the pre-modern state that disproportionately affects women. Now, let's look at this from the law code. If the wife of a man is walking on the highway and a man seizes her, says to her, I will surely have intercourse with you, because that's how every man declares before he has, he rapes her. If she be not willing and defend herself, at the word of the woman who he has raped, the elders will prosecute him and he will get killed. Now, why is this? There's no punishment for the woman because, again, remember, women were considered property. This would be literally kind of a case of highway robbery. If the wife of a man goes out from her house and visit a man where he lives and he have intercourse with her, knowing that she is a man's wife, the man and the women will be put to death. In other words, the death, in this case, for adultery has been set. Now, think about this. And then think about other laws that will be inherited from this. Go to the case of when Jesus witnesses a woman about to be stoned for the crime of adultery. And what are we seeing? Is this kind of sentiment continuing into, now, of course, the woman who's going to be stoned, this is happening in a Jewish society, right? So we see that this is kind of a law that will influence later Jewish societies. And when we say what law that is, that's what we call Mosaic law, or law that developed from Moses. Think the Ten Commandments, okay? And not only would this influence Jewish law, but Muslim law as well. The important thing to understand is these kind of punishments, because usually it's associated with, this is one form of Islamic punishment. We have to realize that this is a form of punishment that predates Islam. In fact, it predates Judaism as well. Now look at this, how we have the first case of divorce law. If a man divorces his wife, if he wishes, he may give her something or not. He doesn't have to give her anything. No such thing as alimony. She will be without anything. Now look at this, if the wives of a man, now what does this tell us? That there was polygamy around this time. Or daughters of a man go out on the street, their heads are to be veiled. Now this is hugely important. I can't tell you again how much it is, because it's just like the argument I made about the punishment for adultery. Because you see, in this day and age, we associate the veil with Muslim women. You have to realize the veil is a tradition that not only predates Christianity, Judaism, it predates all those what we call Abrahamic religions. The veil is an ancient tradition in the region that's not only practiced in the Syrian Empire, it's practiced in ancient Iran, Egypt, ancient Greece, and ancient Rome. And keep in mind, these are all contiguous areas, right? Now, why is that? Women wore the veil to distinguish themselves from prostitutes. You see here, the wives of a man or the daughter of the man, the minute you wear a veil, that indicates you're property of the man. Okay? And here you get a very good insight into the thinking of that time. Veiled harlots and slaves, in other words, veiled prostitutes and slaves, that is false advertising. They were not allowed to wear a veil. If they did, they would have their garments seized, and look at this, they would be whipped 50 times and then they would be tarred. That's how strict the law was in the Assyrian Empire. And what this is, so this is quite important, that the veil would be now a symbol of proprietorship. This is how a woman indicated her relationship in society. But a woman in the society, the minute she went from daughter to the husband, still would wear the veil, because basically the veil indicated you belong to a particular man. And think about this. So what do we have in this picture here? We have my ex-girlfriend marrying some guy to make me jealous. But look what happened prior to her tying the knot. Think of the wedding ceremony. The bride is what? Veiled, right? And who walks her down the aisle? Her father, not her mother, who in theory gave birth to her, right? You think that would make sense? No, because think about this tradition. The man walks the bride down the aisle. And we already know what the word bride means. It means cook. Because that is a reflection of the old tradition. The father is transferring ownership of his daughter to the new owner, her husband. And what does the husband do during the wedding ceremony? He lifts the veil. And in that process of lifting the veil, he's looking at his property for the first time. And then, of course, they smooch, right? But I'm not sure if that had in ancient time. But think of the wedding ceremony, and why does the bride have to wear a veil? It comes from this very old tradition of the veil symbolizing property. And if you think of the wedding ceremony, that is, I would say, quite a misogynist ceremony. And that, yeah, the woman is just simply the property of one man being transferred to another. It's like signing over the lease of your used Jetta or, yeah. Okay. Then we have the New Babylonian Empire. Again, I'm not going to ask you the names of any of these empires or their dates. I just want you to know the entity I'm referring to, and so we can set up the discussion of the primary sources. And the New Babylonian Empire created one of the most famous primary sources in history, the Law of Hammurabi. So what did the Law of Hammurabi say? Let's look at it. Now, what are we seeing here? Every single primary source. What level of patriarchy are we looking at? This is all patriarchy of the state. Here is pre-modern patriarchy of the state. If a woman so hated her husband that she declared, "You may not have me," her record shall be investigated at her city council, and if she was careful and was not at fault, even though her husband has been going out and disparaging her, that woman may take her dowry and go off to her father's house. Now, what do we see by this time? That there is a dowry. This is what the dowry is for, is to give the woman some kind of stability if her husband either leaves her or dies. Now, if she was not careful, and we talked about this part of the law, but was a tramp. Now, what do we see here? This is why I went into a long discussion about the words we use. The words we've used have been used as long to insult women, have been used since antiquity. She humiliated her husband. She will be thrown into the water. In other words, drowned. Now, ancient Middle Eastern societies weren't necessarily misogynistic. Look at ancient Egyptian law. In other words, all these empires had to have cities, but not every city and the way women were treated was universal in the ancient Middle East and Mediterranean. Ancient Egyptian law was relatively, we could say, progressive if we're talking about gender terms. A husband is liable to 100 lashes and the loss of his property should he leave his wife. I could say ancient Egyptian is much more progressive than Brazil or Mexico, where there's really no punishment for domestic abuse. And then what do we have? The first superpower, if we could call it, the first great empire, the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire was quite a misogynistic empire. Now, let's look at Persian law. And keep in mind, all of these law documents exist because they come to us through archaeology. And if the archaeology has writing on it, then boom, it's a historical primary source. Now, this is religion. This is patriarchy of the state, but it's also number one, religious patriarchy. Let's look at this. The woman who obeys her husband will be rewarded by the Lord with eternal salvation. By the way, Persian law and the ancient Persian society was Zoroastrian. Now, Zoroastrianism is one of the first religions that's not polytheistic. It's dualistic, arguing that there is a good God and a bad God, and the fight over the fate of human souls. A God that we can recognize as the monotheistic God today, and this guy, the adversary, and how do you say an adversary in Hebrew, the shaitan, which became the Satan. And in later religions, they weren't no longer dualists. The Satan becomes a fallen angel, right? Zoroastrian was also the first religion that gave us a notion of an afterlife in heaven. And we see this in the first sentence. Now, if a woman slightly defies her husband, what will she do in the hell? And Zoroastrianism also is one of the first religions that give us a notion of a hell. She will burn in hell licking hot irons. Woman is a field, all which grows there belongs to its owner, even if he did not plant it, okay? So we see anyway, you get the idea. This is state and religious patriarchy of the ancient Persian Empire. Now, the ancient Persian Empire, if we look at this territory, was more or less conquered by Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great didn't try to impose Greek culture on the conquered. He tried to fuse the cultures of the territory he conquered. In other words, once he conquered the Persian superpower, he wanted to carry on every tradition of the Persian emperor. So, the Persian emperor now, keep in mind, in the ancient times in the Middle East, there's no limit to how many wives you can have. The Persian emperor had around 365. So what did that mean for Alexander? If he wanted to be like the Persian emperor, what did he choose to do? He too chose to have 365 wives, okay, one for every day of the year. The first limit, one criticism, and I mentioned this because one criticism of Islam in the present is how it allows the marriage of 4 wives. Now we'll get to this. There's a historical reason that we'll get into later that allows 4 wives. But you have to understand, in the regional context, what made that so revolutionary? Now it's hard to understand because it sounds retrograde. But what did Muhammad do was, for one of the first times in the region, set a limit to unlimited polygamy. Setting a limit at that time was revolutionary for the region. Now keep in mind, Alexander the Great's tutor was the philosopher Aristotle. And look at the kind of misogynist sentiments that came from Aristotle. Man's nature is more rounded and complete. Woman is more compassionate, but also more jealous. She fights more. She strikes more. She's more deceptive. Okay, so this is misogyny, no matter what way you cut it. Now, of course, Aristotle not only influenced We tend to think of him as a Western philosopher, but you can't underestimate the profound influence of Aristotle on Middle Eastern philosophy as well. In fact, we get the philosophy of Aristotle because his books were so widely translated in the Middle East. It's not until much later in European history that Europeans translate Aristotle from Arabic texts. So in other words, Aristotle is a misogynist for both West and East, so to speak. But remember, he is considered the father of Western philosophy. These misogynistic aspects of his life corpus often tends to get neglected. Now, also in terms of how we imagine the West, we usually imagine Western civilization beginning in ancient Greece. But you have to realize, in ancient Greece at that time, look where Alexander conquered. Okay, ancient Greece went from Macedonia to the entire Middle East. I mean, if you see how far he conquered, there's a reason why in Jesus's lifetime everybody spoke Greek, even though it was the Roman Empire. Greek culture had been so prevalent in the Middle East that the Roman language of Latin couldn't displace Greek. There's a reason why the New Testament is written entirely in Greek. It has to do with Alexander's conquest. So if Greek language infused the Middle East, let's look at, other Greek words that influenced the Middle East. What is the gynaikeum? The gynaikeum referred to a particular area in a home of any Greek speaker. So whether we're talking about Athens or the greatest Greek city of all of history around this time, Alexandria in Egypt, the gynaikeum was the part of the house away from the street where the women were sequestered. There was a part of the house that faced the street. That was where foreign men came in, and the man of the house would meet them. No woman was allowed there. The furthest part from the public eye, that was the gynaikeum. And that's where the women, that's where the daughters and the mothers stayed, okay? And look what word we get from this. From that word, we get gynecology. What was the Greek house known as? The Greek household, was known as the oikos, okay? And from that, we get the word economics, the study of how households are run. What else can we say about ancient Greek culture? We're still in the polytheistic era. Think of the case of Medusa. What was Medusa's crime? Why did she become this horrible creature? And ancient Greek myth tells us a lot about societal attitudes. What was her crime? She was raped. And as a rape victim, she was punished with a head of snakes that turned somebody to stone. In other words, what are we seeing a continuity from ancient Greece or the ancient Assyrians, where rape is the woman's fault? And what are you looking here? This is the head of Medusa at the bottom of a pillar it was a place to store water. But here you can see kind of another ancient Greek depiction of Medusa. Now, by the time the Romans come, we're still in a polytheistic Middle East, right? Judaism is the only monotheistic religion around. We'll talk about Judaism later, okay? But in the Roman era, we still have a polytheistic era. But even during the time of the Romans, there was still a good number of goddesses that were worshipped. During the Roman era, actually, maybe this is a good place to pause, and I'll talk about the Roman era. So what I'm going to do is we have 3-hour lectures. Just because of technology, I need to break them up into 3 50-minute lectures, just because it's too hard to unload anything bigger. So let me pause here, and then we'll talk about the Romans in the second part. Thank you.